The Battle of Culloden was the final confrontation of the Jacobite Rising of 1745 and part of a religious civil war in Britain. On 16 April 1746, the Jacobite forces of Charles Edward Stuart fought and were decisively defeated by Loyalist troops commanded by William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, near Inverness in the Scottish Highlands. Queen Anne had died in 1714 without any surviving children and was the last monarch of the House of Stuart. Under the terms of the Act of Settlement 1701, she was succeeded by her second cousin George I of the House of Hanover, who was a descendant of the Stuarts through his maternal grandmother, Elizabeth, a daughter of James VI and I. The Hanoverian victory at Culloden halted the Jacobite intent to overthrow the House of Hanover and restore the House of Stuart to the British throne. Charles Stuart never again mounted any further attempts to challenge Hanoverian power in Great Britain. The conflict was the last pitched battle fought on British soil. Charles Stuart's Jacobite army consisted largely of Catholics, Scottish Highlanders, as well as a number of Lowland Scots and a small detachment of Englishmen from the Manchester Regiment. The Jacobites were supported and supplied by the Kingdom of France from Irish and Scots units in the French service. A composite battalion of infantry comprising detachments from each of the regiments of the Irish Brigade plus one squadron of Irish cavalry in the French army served at the battle alongside the regiment of Royal Scots raised the previous year to support the Stuart claim. The British government forces were mostly Protestants, English, along with a significant number of Scottish Lowlanders and Highlanders, a battalion of Ulstermen and some Hessians from Germany and Austrians. The quick and bloody battle on Culloden Moor was over in less than an hour when, after an unsuccessful Highland charge against the government lines, the Jacobites were routed and driven from the field. Between 1,500 and 2,000 Jacobites were killed or wounded in the brief battle. Government losses were lighter, with 50 dead and 259 wounded, although recent geophysical studies on the government burial pit suggest the figure to be nearer 300. The battle and its aftermath continue to arouse strong feelings. The University of Glasgow awarded Cumberland an honorary doctorate, but many modern commentators allege that the aftermath of the battle and subsequent crackdown on Jacobitism were brutal, and earned Cumberland the sobriquet Butcher. Efforts were subsequently taken to further integrate the comparatively wild Highlands into the Kingdom of Great Britain. Civil penalties were introduced to weaken Gaelic culture and attack the Scottish clan system. Background: Charles Edward Stuart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, or the Young Pretender, arrived in Scotland in 1745 to incite a rebellion of Stuart sympathisers against the House of Hanover. He successfully raised forces, mainly of Scottish Highland clansmen, and slipped past the Hanoverians stationed in Scotland and defeated a force of militiamen at the Battle of Prestonpans. The city of Edinburgh was occupied, but the castle held out and most of the Scottish population remained hostile to the rebels. Others, while sympathetic, were reluctant to lend overt support to a movement whose chances were unproven. The British government recalled forces from the war with France in Flanders to deal with the rebellion. After a lengthy wait, Charles persuaded his generals that English Jacobites would stage an uprising in support of his cause. He was convinced that France would launch an invasion of England as well. His army of around 5,000 invaded England on 8 November 1745. They advanced through Carlisle and Manchester to Derby in a position where they appeared to threaten London. It is often alleged that King George II made plans to decamp to Hanover, but there is no evidence for this, and the king is on record as stating that he would lead the troops against the rebels himself if they approached London. The Jacobites met only token resistance. There was, however, little support from English Jacobites, and the French invasion fleet was still being assembled. The armies of Field Marshal George Wade and of William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, were approaching. In addition to the militia, London was defended by nearly 6,000 infantry, 700 horse and 33 artillery pieces, and the Jacobites received reports of a third army closing on them. The Jacobite general, Lord George Murray, and the Council of War insisted on returning to join the growing force in Scotland. On 6 December 1745, they withdrew, with Charles Edward Stuart leaving command to Murray. On the long march back to Scotland, the Highland army wore out its boots and demanded all the boots and shoes of the townspeople of Dumfries as well as money and hospitality. The Jacobites reached Glasgow on 25 December. There they reprovisioned, having threatened to sack the city, and were joined by a few thousand additional men. They then defeated the forces of General Henry Hawley at the Battle of Falkirk Muir. The Duke of Cumberland arrived in Edinburgh on 30 January to take over command of the government army from General Hawley. He then marched north along the coast, with the army being supplied by sea. 6 weeks were spent at Aberdeen training. The king's forces continued to pressure Charles. He retired north, losing men and failing to take Stirling Castle or Fort William, but he invested Fort Augustus and Fort George in Inverness Shire in early April. Charles then took command again, and insisted on fighting a defensive action. Hugh Rose of Culravick entertained Charles Edward Stuart and the Duke of Cumberland respectively on 14 and 15 April 1746. Before the Battle of Culloden, Charles's manners and deportment were described by his host as most engaging. Having walked out with Mr. Rose, before sitting down he watched trees being planted. He remarked, "How happy, sir, you must feel, to be thus peaceably employed in adorning your mansion, whilst all the country round is in such commotion." Culravick was a firm supporter of the House of Hanover, but his adherence was not solicited, nor were his preferences alluded to. The next day, the Duke of Cumberland called at the castle gate, and when Culravick went to receive him, he bluffly observed, "So you had my cousin Charles here yesterday?" Culravick replied, "What am I to do? I am Scots," to which Cumberland replied, "You did perfectly right." Opposing forces. Jacobite army. The bulk of the Jacobite army was made up of Highlanders and most of its strength was volunteers. These men made up the gentlemen, cavalry and lowland units, and as such did much of the fighting during the campaign. The clans which supported the Jacobite cause tended to be Roman Catholic and Scottish Episcopalian, while clans which tended to be Presbyterian sided more with the British government. Nearly three-quarters of the Jacobite army was composed of Highland clansmen who were either Roman Catholic or Episcopalian. The Highlanders served in the clan regiments which were recruited largely from the Highlands of Scotland. One of the fundamental problems with the Jacobite army was the lack of trained officers. The lack of professionalism and training was readily apparent. Even the colonels of the MacDonald regiments of Clan Ranald in Keppoch considered their men to be uncontrollable. A typical clan regiment was made up of a small minority of gentlemen who would bear the clan name, and under them the common soldiers or clansmen, who bore a mixed bag of names. The clan gentlemen formed the front ranks of the unit and were more heavily armed than their impoverished tenants who made up the bulk of the regiment. Because they served in the front ranks, the gentlemen suffered higher proportional casualties than the common clansmen. The gentlemen of the Appin regiment suffered 1/4 of those killed, and 1/3 of those wounded from their regiment. The Jacobites started the campaign poorly armed. At the Battle of Prestonpans, some only had swords, Lochaber axes, pitchforks and scythes. Although popular imagination pictures the common Highlander as being equipped with a broadsword, targe and pistol, it was only officers or gentlemen who were equipped in this way. Further illustrating this point, following the conclusion of the battle, Cumberland reported that there were 2,320 firelocks recovered from the battlefield, but only 190 broadswords. From this, it can be determined that of the roughly 1,000 Jacobites killed at Culloden, no more than one-fifth carried a sword. As the campaign progressed, the Jacobites improved their equipment considerably. For instance, 1,500–1,600 stack of arms were landed in October. In consequence, by the time of the Battle of Culloden, the Jacobite army was equipped with 0.69 in caliber French and Spanish firelocks. During the latter stage of the campaign, the Jacobites were reinforced with units of French regulars. These units, like Fitzjames Horse, and the Irish pickets, were drawn from the Irish Brigade. Another unit was the Royal Écossaise, which was a Scottish unit in French service. The majority of these troops were Irish-born. Lists of prisoners at Marshalsea, Berwick and prison interviews conducted by Captain Eyre show some of these men to be English-born, claiming to have been press-ganged or seized as prisoners on British ships. Fitzjames Horse was the only Jacobite cavalry unit to fight the whole battle on horseback. Around 500 Irish pickets in the French army fought in the battle, some of whom were thought to have been press-ganged from 6th Foot taken at Fort Augustus. The Royal Écossaise also contained deserters, and the commander, Drummond, attempted to raise a second battalion after the unit had arrived in Scotland. The Jacobite artillery has been generally regarded as being ineffective in the battle. Some modern accounts claim that the Jacobite artillery suffered from having cannon with different calibers of shot. In fact, all but one of the Jacobite cannon were 3-pounders. Government Army. The UK Government Army at the Battle of Culloden was made up of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Of the Army's 16 infantry battalions present, 4 were Scottish units and 1 was Irish. The officers of the infantry were from the upper classes and aristocracy, while the rank and file were made up of poor agricultural workers. On the outbreak of the Jacobite Rising, extra incentives were given to lure recruits to fill the ranks of depleted units. For instance, on the 6th of September 1745, every recruit who joined the Guards before the 24th of September was given £6, and those who joined in the last days of the month were given £4. Regiments were named after their colonel. In theory, an infantry regiment would comprise up to 10 companies of up to 70 men. They would then be 815 strong, including officers. However, regiments were rarely anywhere near this large, and at the Battle of Culloden, the regiments were not much larger than about 400 men. The government cavalry arrived in Scotland in January 1746. They were not combat experienced, having spent the preceding years on anti-smuggling duties. A standard cavalryman had a land service pistol and a carbine. However, the main weapon used by the British cavalry was a sword with a 35-inch blade. The Royal Artillery vastly outperformed their Jacobite counterparts during the Battle of Culloden. However, up until this point in the campaign, the government artillery had performed dismally. The main weapon of the artillery was the 3-pounder. This weapon had a range of 500 yards and fired 2 kinds of shot: round iron and canister. The other weapon used was the Coehorn mortar. These had a caliber of 4 2/5 inches. Lead up to battle. On the 30th of January, the Duke of Cumberland arrived in Scotland to take command of the government forces after the previous failures by Cope and Hawley. Cumberland decided to wait out the winter, and moved his troops northwards to Aberdeen. Around this time, the army was increased by 5,000 Hessian troops. The Hessian force, led by Prince Frederick of Hesse, took up position to the south to cut off any path of retreat for the Jacobites. The weather had improved to such an extent by the 8th of April that Cumberland again resumed the campaign. The government army reached Culloden on the 11th of April, where it was joined by 6 battalions and 2 cavalry regiments. Days later, the government army approached the River Spey, which was guarded by a Jacobite force of 2,000, made up of the Jacobite Cavalry, the Lowland regiments, and over half of the army's French regulars. The Jacobites quickly turned and fled, first towards Elgin and then to Nairn. By the 14th of April, the Jacobites had evacuated Nairn, and Cumberland camped his army at Balblair just west of the town. The Jacobite forces of about 5,400 left their base at Inverness, leaving most of their supplies, and assembled 5 miles to the east near Drummersea, around 12 miles before Nairn. Charles Edward Stuart had decided to personally command his forces and took the advice of his Adjutant General, Secretary O'Sullivan, who chose to stage a defensive action at Drummersea Moor, a stretch of open moorland enclosed between the walled Culloden enclosures to the north and the walls of Culloden Park to the south. Lord George Murray did not like the ground, and with other senior officers pointed out the unsuitability of the rough moorland terrain, which was highly advantageous to the Duke, with the marshy and uneven ground making the famed Highland charge somewhat more difficult while remaining open to Cumberland's powerful artillery. They had argued for a guerrilla campaign, but Charles Edward Stuart refused to change his mind. Night attack at Nairn on the 15th of April. The government army celebrated Cumberland's 25th birthday by issuing 2 gallons of brandy to each regiment. At Murray's suggestion, the Jacobites tried that evening to repeat the success of Preston Pans by carrying out a night attack on the government encampment. Murray proposed that they set off at dusk and march to Nairn. In support of Perth, Charles Edward Stuart would bring up the second line. The Jacobite force, however, started out well after dark at about 2000. Murray led the force cross-country with the intention of avoiding government outposts. This, however, led to very slow going in the dark. Murray's one-time aide-de-camp, James Chevalier de Johnston, later wrote, "This march across country in a dark night which did not allow us to follow any track, and accompanied with confusion and disorder. By the time the leading troop had reached Culloden, still 2 miles from where Murray's wing was to cross the River Nairn and encircle the town, there was only 1 hour left before dawn." After a heated council with other officers, Murray concluded that there was not enough time to mount a surprise attack and that the offensive should be aborted. O'Sullivan went to inform Charles Edward Stuart of the change of plan, but missed him in the dark. Meanwhile, instead of retracing his path back, Murray led his men left, down the Inverness road, in the darkness. While Murray led 1/3 of the Jacobite forces back to camp, the other 2/3 continued towards their original objective, unaware of the change in plan. One account of that night even records that Perth and Drummond made contact with government troops before realizing the rest of the Jacobite force had turned home. Not long after the exhausted Jacobite forces had made it back to Culloden, reports came of the advancing government troops. By then, many Jacobite soldiers had dispersed in search of food, while others were asleep in ditches and outbuildings. However, military historian Jeremy Black has contended that even though the Jacobite force had become disordered and lost the element of surprise, the night attack remained viable, and that if the Jacobites had advanced, the conditions would have made British morale vulnerable and disrupted their fire discipline.